Part 2. Up Then. Los Angeles, California, July 11th, 2029. Wednesday, 9:01 a.m. The moon had risen, but thick layers of slightly radioactive cumulus, black as iron, prevented any light from coming through. Cars were stopped in rusted rows, still bumper to bumper, a frozen sculpture that someone might have called the last rush hour. Buildings that once towered over the freeways had been shattered by some unimaginable force, like kicked-down sandcastles. Wind blew through the desolation, keening with the sound of 10 million dead souls. It scurried snow into drifts, stark white against the charred rubble. Here and there were heaps of fire-blackened human bones, and beyond, a vast tundra of skulls amid shattered concrete. At a nearby playground, intense heat had half-melted the jungle gym. The blast had knocked the swing set onto its side, and the merry-go-round had sagged in the firestorm. The faint hieroglyphs of hopscotch lines were still visible, seared into the asphalt. And next to them, the dark silhouettes of little bodies, flash-burned into the concrete in mid-play. Near a burnt and rusted tricycle, the tiny skull of its owner stared up accusingly, out of the drifts. 3 billion human lives had ended on August 29th, 1997. The tenacious survivors of the nuclear fire called the war Judgment Day. Those with endurance had lived through unimaginable hell fire and then Arctic cold, only to face a new nightmare. A metal foot crushed the child's skull like china, as a chromed skeleton stopped for a moment in the cold blast of air, hefting a massive battle rifle. The ruined city was reflected in the cyborg's hydraulically actuated endoskeleton that was the combat chassis of the Series 800 Terminator, unadorned by the usual covering of organic skin grown for camouflage. This was the primary anti-personnel weapon controlled by Skynet, designed to penetrate the warrens and hiding holes of the city, where the human prey huddled. The endoskeleton's glowing red eyes swept the dead terrain without emotion, all its intelligence focused through its visual and thermal sensors. Hunting. Suddenly, they locked onto a target. It saw the distant, running figure of a digitized geometric map overlaying its scanners. Symbols and graphics rapidly appeared on the center display as the machine's complex wafer circuit brain projected several possible trajectories for the target. The most likely path was highlighted. The endoskeleton swiftly raised its rifle, a Westinghouse M25 40-watt phased plasma rifle pulse gun. A compact burst flashed from the barrel. The figure, a young boy in rags, was center punched. His chest erupted outward, vaporizing into red crystals in the freezing air. He sprawled into a smoking heap on the blackened sludge. A guerrilla soldier, hefting a battered RPG rocket launcher, suddenly rose up behind the endoskeleton. As the cyborg started to snap around, the soldier fired the rocket, which screamed towards the humanoid machine, and in a bright blast of orgasmic energy, tore off the top half. The endoskeleton took a few uncertain steps, then toppled, its legs spasming in the snow. The soldier strode up and spat on what was now just very expensive scrap metal, then motioned to someone hunkered down in the shadows. It was a shivering 10-year-old girl, nearly frozen in her tattered pullover sweater. She tentatively approached her father, glanced down with fear at the endoskeleton in the snow. He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder and said, "I told you, it's not over till it's over." She nodded gravely. It was a saying that John Connor had used as a slogan for his army. It gave people hope and strength to carry on the fight. To Skynet, human stubbornness made no sense. They fought when logic told their synthetic intelligence that they were beaten. They relentlessly poured out of the rubble like a bacterial plague, their patterns of counterattack clever and difficult to predict. and humans reproduced at an alarming rate, their sexual appetites evidently fanned by the high threat of total annihilation. Even though it took at least 8 years before the human young could be made ready for battle, they were beginning to outpace Skynet's manufacturing capabilities, and they were quickly learning to find the soft spots in the metal vanguard, decimating Skynet's army of killing machines. Soon, there would be more human soldiers than non-human. The hypercomputer had miscalculated gravely on something it was still furiously analyzing: human will. So far, it had not come to a conclusion, and the war was grinding into its 31st year. The rising sound of roaring turbines caused the man to grab his daughter and dart across the uneven terrain for cover. Searchlights blazed down as a formation of flying hunter-killer machines on patrol passed overhead and moved on towards the jagged horizon, which was lit up by intermittent flashes and the distant thunder of a pitched battle. At the intersection of what used to be Pico and Robertson, the desperate combat raged. The ragtag guerrilla army consisted of Doberman-mean young men and women. They came from southern hemisphere countries, mostly Africa, South America, a few from Australia. Most of the survivors of the nuclear war between the northern hemisphere superpowers lived below the equator. Under John Connor's leadership, they had come to the ruined cities to reclaim them from Skynet's Steel Legion. Energy bolts crisscrossed across the field of battle, revealing the ranks of advancing machines in nightmarish flashes. The computer's forces consisted of tank-like mobile robot gun platforms called hunter-killers, four-legged, running gun pods called centurions, aerial HKs, centipede-like bombs called silverfish, which snaked into human emplacements to explode, and the humanoid Terminators in various stages of camouflage. Beam weapons fired like concentrated lightning, arcing out to burst buildings, earth, metal, and flesh in gut-pounding explosions. A battered pickup truck, covered with customized armor plating, bolted into the open, the gunner in the back rising to target an aerial HK, above with a hand-launched Stinger missile. The HK's turret gun angrily whirled just as the human fired. The missile cut through the night like a hot knife, striking one of the HK's turbines. The sky flared into flame as two halves of the huge flying machine fell onto the battlefield, one flattening what little was left of a burned building, the other pounding a small squadron of Centurions into the ground. The gunner yelled triumphantly, but turned as a ground-shaking rumble rose up behind him. A massive HK tank suddenly smashed through a pile of debris and rolled towards him like a wall of iron. He only had time to scream as the tread slammed into the truck and crushed it like a beer can. A few blocks away, in the dark nooks and crannies of the collapsed rock pile that was once the Westside Pavilion shopping mall, an intense firefight with Terminator endoskeletons raged. The human soldiers there were like most of John Connor's army, bleeding, frostbitten, wrapped in rags. This was Valley Forge, but with better weapons. Cowan, a 17-year-old guerrilla, leaped from cover and fired a handheld grenade launcher directly at 3 charging Terminators, blasting them off their feet. They lay still, their skulls punched through and circuits fried. The boy rapidly fumbled to reload. A man stepped out of the shadows. "Let me help you," he said calmly, and reached for the grenade launcher. Cowan instinctively knew that something was wrong. The stranger was wearing the gorilla armband all right, but it was last week's colour. Cowan jammed the huge shell into the firing chamber and pulled the trigger, then leaped behind a large chunk of fallen concrete. The back of the boy's head was singed by the heat of the shockwave. He sat up, groggy, stemming a trickle of blood that ran out of his left ear. Cowan realized, with growing horror, that he could no longer hear anything on that side. But he smiled with satisfaction when he saw what the grenade had done to the man. He was on the ground, nearly cut in two, his flesh torn open, revealing patches of chromed metal underneath. The thing's spine, or neuron trunk, had been sheared, one sparkling end of it showing through the twisted flesh. The Terminator spasmed insanely, like a puppet tangled in its own strings. In a moment, the joint servos ground to a halt, and the glowing eyes winked out. Cowan took no time to gloat over his kill. He was too busy reloading. A silverfish scuttled out from under a pile of rubble and stopped between his legs. The boy looked down and screamed. He twisted his torso and flung himself away. The silverfish erupted, spraying the area with razor-sharp and sizzling hot shrapnel. Cowan hit the ground, immediately rolling back onto his feet in a ready crouch, managing to get another grenade into the grenade launcher as he did so. The area was thick with smoke and dust. Cowan rose and stumbled over a new pile of debris into a corridor, his eyes stinging from the acrid fumes. And now he couldn't seem to hear very well. Also, a chunk of muscle and skin had been torn out of his forearm by shrapnel. In another moment, the pain would hit him, hard. Still, he counted himself lucky. Just how lucky, he was about to discover. As he reached an intersection, a blur suddenly lurched up from a hole in the floor. A Terminator endoskeleton. Its steel fist jackhammered his ribs, and he flew back against the wall. The grenade launcher skidded down the corridor, out of reach. The boy gasped for breath, realizing by the pain each one cost that at least one of his ribs must be broken. The cyborg rose up and stood over him, swinging its battle rifle barrel towards Cowan's head. This time, there was no escape. The black cavity of the Terminator's barrel welled to an infinity of endings. This was death then, the boy thought. The machine would blast his head off in the next second, and then... But strangely, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Cowan looked into the Terminator's face. Its lipless mouth revealed enameled titanium teeth set into a perpetually grinning jaw. The gleaming skull seemed to be laughing at him. A high-tech reaper come for his soul. The glowing red demon eyes were fixed on him. It couldn't miss, and yet it did not fire. The boy took a breath, amazed he was still capable of it. It seemed now as if many seconds had passed. Then he realized the Terminator was not moving. In fact, the thing's eyes had gone dark. The boy painfully pulled himself up the wall to stand on shaky legs. The cyborg was still staring at the space where he had been sitting. Hesitantly, he stepped up to the chrome skeleton and pushed against its chest. The Terminator teetered, then toppled onto its side with a loud thud. A gorilla appeared at the end of the corridor. Cowan looked up. It was Bryn. They had fought together many times, but he could not say anything, only gape, his senses pounded by shock and the pulsing ache of his wounds. She cautiously approached and looked down at the inert endoskeleton. He finally managed to croak a few words. It just stopped. They never just stop, Bryn said. She put his arm around her neck and gingerly led him back towards what was left of their squad. A few minutes later, they would both discover the reason why the endoskeleton in the corridor had indeed just stopped. In a makeshift gun emplacement at the edge of battle, a man too important to be risked in the line of fire watched the distant combat with field glasses, standing still as a statue among running, shouting techs and officers. He wore the uniform of a guerrilla general. Sadly, he lowered the binoculars, revealing 45-year-old features made severe by constant stress. The left side of his face was heavily scarred, yet he was still an impressive man, forged in the furnace of a lifetime of war. The name stitched on his jacket read, Connor. Behind him, he could hear the scratchy chatter of radio traffic, the voices hyped with the adrenaline rush of combat, calling in position reports. They were coming in from other battlefields as well. From other cities, other states. San Francisco, Seattle, Albuquerque, Chicago. New York had been overrun by the machines years ago. The voices spoke in many languages: Spanish, Swahili, Japanese, and English. This was the first truly international army. The volunteers had come from countries least damaged by the war. They came together to survive. Today, there were battles against Skynet's forces all over the world, but the two most important ones were happening in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, where Skynet's mainframe was housed. The other was here, in the West Side, where the real prize was. The site of Skynet's second largest and most guarded underground complexes. The vast conclave was encircled with a lethal concentration of defensive machines. In the last 2 days, human casualties had been very high. But John knew that eventually they would win. They now had the firepower and, more importantly, the will. But the loss of lives tore at him. So many young men and women desperately needed to start over after the blood of battle had dried. To see the soldiers who had fought alongside him for years slaughtered by the metal motherfuckers so near the end of the battle was, to John, infuriating. It wasn't a fair universe, nor a kind one. If there was a God, his love and 45 cents would buy you a coffee. No one seemed to be at the cosmic controls anymore. It was every man for himself, until Skynet became alive and filled the void left by a seemingly disinterested God. Its vision was very controlled. The ultimate dream of man, carried out by one of man's lowliest tools: eliminate evil men. But there was a touch of evil in all men, and Skynet was having trouble separating the worst of them out. So the totality of humanity, with all its biologic messiness, wasn't wanted. And to this machine god, forgiveness just did not compute. Only cold retribution for the sins of the past. John ached to end this war and start over, to correct the mistakes of history. But like other generals from other wars in the past, he wasn't sure what kind of world he was making possible. He had time only to strategize this war. It hadn't occurred to him until recently that there would be a life after the conflict. It seemed so far away, the horizon of it always out of reach, no matter how long you traveled towards it. Something was happening over on Pico and Robertson. John raised the glasses again and zoomed in on an aerial HK, suddenly spinning out of control like a frisbee, slicing down to burst into a massive fireball that lit up the ravaged terrain all around. Somebody had just made a good kill. If they survived, John would decorate them. But 2 other HKs suddenly tilted at a crazy angle and dropped to the earth, without being hit. In the bright flare of the flaming debris, John saw a bizarre sight. A squad of endoskeletons standing nearby, oddly frozen in place like toy soldiers, their metal surfaces burnished by the blaze. The flashing of beam weapons lessened, then, miraculously, ceased altogether. John's forces were cautiously emerging from their emplacements and approaching the frozen machines. Another aerial HK, about a mile beyond the battle, hurled down to a fiery death. John was astonished to see the sky suddenly clear of gunships. He scanned the battlefield. None of Skynet's machines were moving. And then an awesome thing happened. It grew quiet. Now all John could hear was the high wail of the wind. No guns, no explosions, no turbine whine or grumbling engines. Even the radios behind him fell silent, until one voice spoke out, the awed emotion detectable under howling static. "This is New Orleans Division. They're not moving, they just stopped." Another voice came on the line, more excited. "This is Chicago. HKs are falling, my God. They all crashed." Another voice overlapped. "San Francisco reporting. I don't get it. The Terminators are just standing there. Another. Nothing came out to stop us. We're inside the factory now and... Then all the radios from all the battlefields began to babble the news. But John already knew what they would say. Had known it for most of his life. Lieutenant Fuentes approached and stood alongside John, gaping at the scene beyond. He spoke so softly that John almost couldn't hear. Just got confirmation. Skynet has been penetrated and destroyed. The two men looked at each other, their faces blank with shock and the awareness of how inane the monumental can seem. The war is over, John. We won. Fuentes took a breath, for him seemingly the first in a century. With the oxygen came emotion. It began as a trickle, then built up pressure until it tore through the restraints of duty and burst out of his lungs as a triumphal shout. It was a shout that in moments would grow to a thundering cheer, repeated long into the day and the following night, as the victors raised their eyes to a sky devoid of machines, and knew that the long war was indeed over. For now, all John Connor could do was sink to his knees. But there was still more work to do. A lot more, before he could really take a breath. And it would begin in the belly of the beast. He grabbed a radio mic and began to give orders. Orders he had been born to give.